I read Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This is the third book in kind of a connected series of books. I'm not going to be talking about the movie. Well, I might be talking about the movie, but this podcast is about the book specific. So if you came looking for movie analysis, sorry, this is not the thing for you. I'm feeling kind of sick while I do this, and it caused me to be a little bit late with this book. But the idea of the podcast is that I do these analyses as soon as I finish the book or as close as I can do it, and just kind of get my raw thoughts out and not overthink it. And so, if my brain is a little bit baked for this one, I apologize. It's a very complex book in a lot of ways. And I think that when you look at Mitchell's novels, this one in particular is kind of a watershed where the structure of the previous two books kind of comes to full fruit. And then this book is almost like the closing of something, and the next books after it are an opening up of something else. They're all still really interconnected and related to each other, but it's kind of like Mitchell moves on after this book. So like I talked about in the previous couple books, there's the idea of the structure of why do things happen the way that they do with people, and how that's related to a chain of consequence, action and reaction, cause and effect, that kind of thing, and how those ideas are related to the philosopher of novels, Mikhail Bakhtin. This is just kind of always on my mind with Mitchell because he is so interested in the polyphony of voices within the human experience. He takes lots of different kinds of people and puts them into his stories, and they drive the action forward and get rewarded and punished in ways that don't feel allegorical to me. They just kind of there's an element of chance in his world that things just might shake out in your favor, whether you're a good person or not, while there's still an underlying morality to everything at the same time, which is really difficult to pull off. I think it's super interesting. It's part of the reason why I keep coming back. And so Bakhtin's ideas about the monological voice versus the polyphonous voice, and how the novel is a uniquely equipped tool for the artist to use the polyphonous voice in, as opposed to older modes of storytelling or genre storytelling that tend to be monological. And the really interesting thing to me in this book, speaking of genre, is how it uses genre in each of the parts of the story. So to talk about the structure here, we have 6 different main characters, and their stories are kind of split in half for 5 of them. It gets to the midpoint kind of reversal stage of a genre story. And at that point, the narrative just cuts off abruptly and we go into another narrative. And these are kind of nested within each other like Marushka dolls, which is a motif that's referenced often throughout the book, the Marushka, kind of those Russian nested dolls, they sit inside of each other. Although I think what's kind of interesting is that the first story is the smallest story, and then they get progressively bigger as you go along. And so somehow they're nested dolls, but the smallest one is on the outside. It's a little bit weird, but you get the idea of what I'm saying, that the stories go about halfway through the narrative and then they cut off until we get to the 6th one. And that progresses as a more traditional narrative all the way through to its ending. And then we go back to the 5th story and get the closing of that one, and then the 4th and the 3rd and the 2nd and the 1st. And so it's kind of, you go into the future because we're moving through time with each one of the stories. We start off in a time of colonialism in the first story with Adam Ewing. And then at the end of the progression of time, we end up on the island of Hawaii, some indeterminate point in a post-apocalyptic future. And so each one of these stories is simultaneously not just moving through time, but like I said, is a genre unto itself. And genre is worth talking about here. So that Bakhtin's idea of genre actually shares the word that, like genetics, gene, genre. And the reason that it has that shared root word of genetic is because it's self-replicating in terms of its structures and outcome. And so the reason that something is a genre is because structurally it repeats itself. The only thing that's really different are aspects of details and whatnot. And so the characters have different names. Maybe their adventures are slightly different from one another. The occurrences are, it's all in the details, how things are going to shake out a little bit differently. But the beginning, middle, and end should follow the structure of the genre. That's what the reader expects. Bakhtin is a kind of, I don't know if contemptuous is the right word, but he's not interested in genre for that reason. He considers it to be a kind of bastardized version of the novel. I don't really feel that way. I love genre fiction. And I think that Bakhtin understood its appeal and why it was more popular than the more complicated and crunchy polyphonous voice kind of stuff that he's talking about with like Dostoevsky, which is the main thing that he concentrates on in his criticism. But all of that to say that Mitchell pulls off this really cool thing here, I think, where he takes various genres, different genres for each one of these stories, pairs it with a different kind of voice, and then melds the whole thing together in a very unique structure that ends up being the kind of polyphonous novel that Bakhtin is talking about. And so he kind of like does the impossible artistically by taking things that are genre and utterly predictable and making them unpredictable again by fusing them together, which is a pretty cool trick. Okay, so to get more down to it, what genre am I talking about with the Adam Ewing part? This would be the kind of like, for one thing, he's writing in a journal in the first person. And so this is the traditional or like the classic kind of historical travelogue novel, right? Like whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it kind of doesn't matter. The whole thing is about the journey, the misadventures, and all of the crazy things that are going to happen once you leave the safe space, especially of Europe typically, and get out into the wider, untrammeled world that the protagonist doesn't know anything about. And I think it certainly follows that kind of trajectory because Adam Ewing is very naive in certain ways and is very also captured by an ideology of racism. He thinks and writes in terms of a white supremacist view, a European-centric view of other people when he writes about the native people of the like New Zealand area kind of islands where he starts out at, and about the indigenous black-skinned person who stows away in his cabin. He does so in ways that are like dehumanizing and again captured by the idea of racism. This is an important idea, I think, to put up, right up front in the book. For one thing, in our modern sensibilities, we're going to see Adam Ewing as not understanding, like normal human rights, not having the correct view of things, the enlightened view of things that we do in our modern time as we read the book. And that brings forth in us a feeling of progress to history, which I think is a super important theme in this story. So we feel like, well, of course, he's racist and backwards and naive about the effects of medicine and all of these kind of things because he lives in the past and people in the past just don't know as much as we do now in the future. We're more enlightened, we're better, and on like that. And so you might feel a kind of sense of superiority and a distaste even for Adam Ewing's perspective in the story. And I think all of that is intentional. And it's even a part of like a twisted kind of pleasure to reading this kind of genre. If you go to like historical journals of the conquistadors in North and South America or stuff like that, you'll see like a very twisted view of the human experience and of your fellow humans, and you'll be like, "Oh, what a bunch of jerks and creeps. I feel so much better about myself," and simultaneously learning things about history at the same time. And so there's like a weird feeling of superiority that you can have that I think this story delivers, but it gets you in on the ground floor of an idea that some people exploit other people, which is a really big theme in this story. The weak are meat, the strong do eat, which is said over and over in the book. So during the course of his opening story, Adam relates to us that he gets onto a ship. He feels like he has some kind of sickness. He consults a doctor. The doctor prescribes a purgative for him, saying that he has some kind of parasite inside of him. And then once the ship gets underway, he finds out that he has a stowaway in his room. And because he has a stowaway in his room, there's a good chance that he could be punished as if he had helped this person to get on the ship. And the ship doesn't have the resources or provisions to provide for somebody who's not paying their way or contributing to the crew. But the stowaway, whose name is Atua, proves that he is a competent seaman and is able to join the crew unpaid for the duration of the trip. And so there's like a whole thing here about, indigenous people being uncivilized and the supremacy of the European culture and people, and how like all of that it's the prerogative of Europeans to conquer the world. And the main moral duty of doing that is to spread civilization to all of these people and places that don't have it. But like I said, the narrative breaks off very suddenly and it moves into the future, into 1930s France, and it becomes an epistolary novel all of a sudden that operates as kind of like a series of one-sided letters chronicling the life of Robert Frobisher, who is an out-of-work musician who's been disgraced in his family and kicked out and is not allowed to be part of academia right now. He's kind of a ne'er-do-well. He is a very horny guy who is causing all kinds of trouble for himself because he gets into these romantic entanglements with all kinds of people. But he is a genuinely talented musician, and he manages to earn a place with a composer named Vivian Ayres, who is an aging composer that was once one of the greatest composers in Europe within, the fictional narrative, diegetically within the universe of the story. He was an important person. I don't think this person is an actual historical person, but I don't know, maybe. But in any case, he goes to this guy and he offers himself as an assistant in order for him to create some kind of masterpiece before he passes away from old age. And there's a reversal here from the previous chapter of a person, like the main character in this case, is offering himself up as a servant for no money, the same way that Atua offered himself up as a servant for no money. And so in the previous chapter, we had Adam Ewing was a privileged white European. And in this case, Frobisher is also a privileged white European, but he is being exploited. He has no home, no money, no job. He only has his talent, and he's going to trade that talent for room and board with Vivian Ayres. He's effectively a slave is my point. And he gets into all kinds of complicated romantic entanglements with Vivian Ayres' wife and later his daughter. And so, is causing trouble for himself in that way. And again, there's this a typical epistolary historical fiction form where the characters get into all kinds of romantic entanglements. What will happen next? We're stepping on the propriety of high society, but we're teetering on the edge of, financial ruin at the same time. And so there's very dramatic things happening in exactly the way that historical romantic fiction genre has stuff happen. And so there's like Frobisher's precarity leads him to do all kinds of things on the one hand out of necessity, but also out of resentment. And so like he feels angry with Vivian for taking advantage of him and for not giving him his due in terms of his talent. But at the same time, he has no choice but to do whatever ridiculous thing Vivian wants at any hour of the day, because if he doesn't, he's not going to have a place to eat and sleep and money to spend. So in this case, there's the idea of, the weak are meat for the strong to eat. Vivian is the strong and Frobisher is the weak. We also get introduced here to the notion, or the person of Friedrich Nietzsche, who the characters quote at various times and has important ideas that are core to the themes in the story. Particularly, Nietzsche has the idea of the eternal recurrence. This is the idea that when you die, you won't go to heaven or hell. You would just repeat the life that you just lived endlessly for eternity, forever. In order to kind of stop a person in their tracks while they're thinking, like you're doing a thing in your life and being like, well, it's okay that I do this thing that I really hate doing, or that is uncomfortable or makes me sad, or that I would rather not do, because in the distant future, after I die, it will get me into heaven and I will be, in bliss and hanging out with God forever and ever, and everything's going to be perfect and great. Well, what if that wasn't true, and what you were doing for all of eternity was doing the uncomfortable, distasteful thing that you don't like? Then you would probably live your life differently, which was the point that Nietzsche was trying to impress on people. There's no reason to suffer now for a reward later when you could just have the reward now, just live your life differently. And so Frobisher kind of takes that whole, live for today, live for the joy of things to heart, and really lives by, like unzipping his pants at every possible opportunity, including sleeping with his boss's wife, Jocasta, who continues to feel love for her husband, Vivian, despite cuckolding him. But she tells Frobisher, thank you, for bringing him back from the brink, that he had kind of given up on life. He had given up on the chance of contributing to the musical community anymore, and was able to like reel him back into being an artist and a musician once again and creating good work, and that she's seen a real change in her husband. And all of this has made Frobisher's life really complicated and uncomfortable. And he's just not sure, like he's in a precarious position, right? Like he has to continue to make this wife happy, or she's going to run to her husband and tell on him that they're having a romantic affair. She has to continue, and Frobisher has to continue to get Vivian to create good work and to be at his beck and call at any second, while also trying to like create his own work and his own music, which was part of the whole point of doing this in the first place, because he has his own musical ambitions, but he's just trying to get back up on his feet again. So he's got a lot on his plate. A lot of stuff is happening, and it feels like you're getting to a real tipping point here, which of course causes the story to come crashing to a stop. Oh, also in this whole thing, we find out that Frobisher runs across the journals from the previous part of Adam Ewing. To get money, Frobisher sells a bunch of books from the library of Vivian Ayres, which is pretty funny. And one of the books that he finds, or half of a book, is the journals of Adam Ewing that we just read. And so Frobisher himself is reading the same thing that we just read, and he's interpreting it and including his interpretation of the story, and it's influencing his story that as he reads it, which is another really important idea and plugs back into kind of the structure of Ghostwritten, right? Where there was that cause and effect relationship that was happening as time progressed forward, but also place moved from east to west. In this case, it's a progression of time that has to do with a cause and effect, but the cause and effect relationship is not between people who are, directly all in the same time, more or less, the same set of decades. We're going to be traveling through a vast period of time in this novel. And so the cause and effect relationship is not people directly, but their stories. And the idea of storytelling and of genre stories that manage to move through time and the influence that they can have on people. And I think this is a real affirmation that Mitchell is making of genre stories in particular. Bakhtin had that kind of looking down on genre that I talked about, but I think Mitchell is affirming here in the story that genre is powerful and can change history for people if they read it at the right time in the right place in their life. So when Frobisher's story comes to a halt, we jump into yet another genre, and the first two stories were told in a first-person mode, first a journal and then in the form of letters. And now this story that's told by Louisa Ray, or it says like the Louisa Ray mysteries, right, are a set of mysteries, really a thriller series. And this would be the first one in the series, if I remember right. Louisa Ray also was a character who was in the end of Ghost Written. She calls into the Bat Segundo show, and she has some thoughts for Bat. Bat Segundo identifies her as a New Yorker who is a highly accomplished crime writer. She writes true crime stories and exposés about crime. In particular, she wrote about the St. Petersburg art heist that happened in Ghost Written. And so this might be the beginning of her kind of ripped from the headlines crime writing career that she's doing under a pseudonym, because this appears to be written as a kind of fiction. The perspective in the story is third-person perspective, and it moves from it's a close third-person perspective that moves from character to character in terms of like who are we seeing through the eyes of at any given time. It's not all through Louisa Ray, and so that it's a abstraction of probably her own lived experience, and she just like named the character after herself and maybe changed a couple of names to protect herself from getting sued. But in any case, like I said, it's a pretty rollicking thriller, and it's about industrial espionage and the energy sector in the 1970s. So again, we've moved forward in several decades from the 1930s in the previous chapter. And in the previous chapter, we had Frobisher writing the letters to a guy who's called Rufus Sixsmith. And early in this story, Louisa Ray gets stuck in an elevator with an elderly Rufus Sixsmith. And so it's the actual guy from the letters that, we never saw his side of the letters or the letters that he was sending. We only heard about them secondhand, but here the character is. And so there's like a direct connection between these characters. While they're stuck in the elevator, they tell each other about their lives a little bit. And the two of them feel a really strong connection that they can't explain. And the explanation for that seems to be that Louisa Ray is a reincarnated soul of Robert Frobisher. And this is an idea that's going to get passed down throughout the story. Each one of the protagonists is actually a reincarnated version of the previous era's protagonist. So if you remember in Ghost Written, there was various characters who could jump from body to body. There was psychic phenomenon, and yet again, we're getting these psychic phenomenon motifs that will be in all of Mitchell's novels. And so this is the idea that over time, there's a kind of resonance of memory that these characters have with each other and with the past that isn't explicit in their mind. They don't directly perceive each other as who they are in their soul, but there's something about it that's speaking in it to a deep part of each of them. And so they form a very, very fast bond. Louisa Ray is an investigative reporter for a kind of tabloid magazine called Spyglass. And Rufus Sixsmith is a renowned physicist who has won the Nobel Prize and is now involved in a regulatory committee that is reviewing a soon-to-be opening nuclear power plant facility that he believes is dangerously constructed in ways that are going to cause massive harm to people when the facility melts down or explodes or has some kind of disaster that's going to probably destroy the surrounding. And so he's written a report where he wants to put a stop to it, which of course is a huge story for Louisa Ray to stumble across. And most of the rest of the story is about her trying to get her hands on the report, and at the same time, the energy company that Sixsmith works for is also trying to get a hold of the report so that they can destroy it. There's a corporate fixer, assassin type guy named Bill Smoke who makes it his job to kind of set up accidents, quote unquote, for inconvenient people and get them out of the way so that this seaboard nuclear plant can open on time so that the corporate people can make their money and stock shares go up. So again, there's a kind of exploitation happening of there's people who are just trying to make money and don't care about who's going to get hurt, in exactly the same way as during colonialist times, people were being exploited in terms of slavery in order for the wider company to make a profit. Here, the lives of people are cheap. They're being murdered and assassinated in order for the energy company to move its agenda forward. And this kind of disrupts this idea of progress, social progress, technological progress that happens as we move forward through time, because what's kind of being showcased is that it's the same savagery of man against man, but it's just the context is a little bit different. Just because Louisa Ray makes a little bit of money doing her journalist job, and just because Sixsmith is a renowned scientist doesn't mean that they are invulnerable to their lives being treated like nothing. And because this story is a thriller, it ends on a real cliffhanger where Sixsmith's suicide is faked, where it's made to look as if he shoots himself. And then Louisa goes to get his report, but instead finds the letters from Frobisher that we read previously. And so she encounters the same letters that we did. And then she's given the report by another source inside of the company that she's cultivated. But before she can go to her boss with it, Bill Smoke, the fixer assassin guy, rams his car into her and pushes her off of a bridge. And so her car crashes into the water. And that's where the story stops. And if you think back to the previous book, Number 9 Dream, that had this entire notion built into it that life it has an arc or a story to it, and that you'll get better at life as you go along and get older. And suddenly you'll have solved your life's meaning or your life's purpose, whatever. And then at that very moment that you do that, all the rules will change, and actually what seemed like a victory will be a defeat, and all of the rules have changed, and now you are at your lowest point when you thought you were at your highest point. And a lot of that has to do, I think, in this book, the kind of structural rebuttal to that is, where is the author or the narrator ending the story? Because that says a lot about what is a win and what is a loss, right? So the actual meta structure of where we are leaving things off has to do with the idea of success or failure. And maybe success or failure are more of a set of perspectives than they are of some kind of retroactive looking back and framing things in a particular way and saying, well, this was a waste of time because it didn't lead to a successful outcome in A, B, and C term. Well, maybe that's not the end of the story. Maybe the end of the story comes several generations later, where that quote unquote failure actually like inspires people to behave differently. And so success comes in a much longer term, perhaps. Like that's a different way to frame it and contextualize. And so like in this case, the reason I think about this is because Louisa Ray's story really seems like a failure. Like she goes through all of these really difficult things, but she's gritty and determined and just like a great thriller protagonist and can't be beaten down. And then boom, she's beaten down. And if the story just ended here where she drowns in the water, the story would be very pessimistic in terms of like, well, big energy is always going to win. You shouldn't fight the man because you could never win and it's just not smart. It's better to be a small fry and stay out of the way. And that way you can live your life at least. And maybe things will get worse. Yes. And they'll be less safe. And yeah, you'll be poor, but at least you'll be alive and you didn't drown in a river, right? So that's one way to end her story, where it seems like she did all the right things, but then she still lost. But her story's not over yet. And I think that's part of taking that structure of the second book and it evolving. That's kind of why I said these 3 books to me feel very interlinked, and that this book really takes the structure of the first 2 books and changes into something else completely in a pretty cool way. So the next part moves us forward into like the early 2000s in London with the ghastly ordeal of Timothy Cavendish. We also saw Timothy Cavendish, I can't even say his name, in Ghostwritten. He was a supporting character to Marco's story. Marco was the actual ghostwriter in Ghostwritten, and Timothy Cavendish was the publisher underwriting his Ghostwritten biography. Speaking of biographies, he has a sales boom because of this crazy true crime biography that this gangster writes. And during the kind of book party for the biography, the criminal takes a critic and throws him off the roof and kills him, which makes it just gives like a notorious air to the whole thing, and it blows up. It blows up the sales of the books and is really the first hit of Cavendish's career. And you get the feeling that Cavendish is really a dirtbag. He is a scam artist almost who loves books, but has made a career of exploiting people. And this genre is like a picaresque or a farce, a comedy where you love to hate the protagonist, where he's just a dirtbag and every bad thing that happens to him kind of makes you grin, and he gets himself into worse and worse trouble, and bad things keep happening to him. And you don't really mind that bad things happen to him. You don't especially feel bad for him. It's just very fun to watch it. It's almost like justice or karma or something, right? That he's like, he's sexist, he's snobbish, he's a little bit racist. He's just an unlikable guy. Like I said, a scam artist. And yet like nothing but bad things happen to him. So it's pretty fun, or I enjoy it a lot. This really changes the tone of the book at this point, where we've been pretty serious up until now. And it gets a little bit more lighthearted and funny with Timothy Cavendish's story. He, despite the big mega hit of this book, he still remains in financial trouble, not only because he's borrowed so much money over the years, but because this guy is a gangster and he goes to jail for murder, because obviously he murdered this dude in front of a lot of people. His gangster buddies want to collect on the royalties that they feel he is owed by the book-going bestseller. And Cavendish just doesn't have the money. And so he has to go on the run from the mob. And if you remember in Ghostwritten, Cavendish's entire operation was underwritten by the shady money that was coming out of Hong Kong with Neil Bros. And so he goes to that same brother and asks him to bail him out. But he's like, hey, I'm broke too. Remember that thing that went down? I never recovered from it. And he's like, but I'll tell you what, I've got some people that I know up in Scotland. Why don't you go up there and you'll be able to hide out from the mob? And so he makes his way up there. And it turns out that his brother kind of sells him out because he put him into a nursing home. And so we see once again, there's a kind of exploitation that's happening of the strong over the weak. The nursing home in this case is characterized not as a care facility, but as a prison for old people. His freedom is taken away. Now, like it doesn't really matter that Cavendish kind of has it coming and that it's kind of fun to see him end up in a terrible circumstance like being in jail for old people. But at the same time, you recognize that he's being dehumanized, and exploited because each one of these people who is in this place is basically a paycheck for the institution. And they're not treated in a dignified way that, you would want your elderly ones to be treated. They're treated pretty badly. And as bad as Cavendish is, the people who work there are even worse. While he was on his way to getting to the nursing home, he did manage to pick up some books that were being submitted to his publishing operation, and like prospective books that he might publish one day. And one of them was the Louisa Ray mystery that we got halfway through, and he also gets halfway in the reading of this half of the story. And so again, there's that chain of consequence. This influences Cavendish's choices and state of mind and ideas and stuff. He doesn't think that the book is very good, which is funny. And within the book, it has the notion of the letters that we read before that, which themselves have the notion of the journal that we read at the beginning. And so you can see how the stories are all nested within each of the other stories. And Cavendish is like very contemptuous of the whole reincarnation bit. And he comments that because the thing about the reincarnation is that each person has the same birthmark that kind of looks like a comet. And a comet was an important idea in Ghostwritten because it might have been the end of the human race on Earth, the way that the ending is kind of left ambiguous. So it's kind of celestial portent of fate and of doom. This might be an apocalyptic type of, and he thinks to himself, like I have a birthmark that looks a lot like that too. It's no big deal. Lots of people have them. So, which actually includes Cavendish in the lineage of the main characters, if anything else. So he is the reincarnated Louisa Ray and Frobisher and Ewing on down the line. And so he gets stuck in this old folks home and he's trying to like figure out how he's going to escape, but then he kind of like he gets poisoned or something. It's not totally clear what happened and he kind of passes out. And then we move forward probably like 100 years. I'm not totally sure because the entire calendar system seems to change into another genre of future dystopian. This part reminds me of like, there's so many future dystopian books in the genre, right? There's Brave New World by Aldous Huxley or like We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, like The Hunger Games, on and on and on. There's a million of these. I love these kind of books. I eat these things up. I think they're great. This is called The Orison of Somni 451. So right there, the 451 is like a number designation, just like in Zamyatin's We novel, where everybody has a number instead of it. So I think that Mitchell knows exactly what he's doing. So this seems to be like Korea deep in the future, a place called Neo-Sokopros. There's an ideology, a political ideology of corporatism or like business culture that has evolved to the state level, a kind of neo-feudalism where people are required to spend money to be consumers. That is like that's like the peasant class almost. Like it's your job to spend money to keep the corporations afloat. And then there are the employee class who are subhuman, a kind of subaltern, to use like a Marxist term, group of people who don't have rights, who don't have identity and aren't considered to be real people, just like in a Brave New. So an Orison is a kind of futuristic device that is used to holographically capture an interview in this case. So there's a kind of post-mortem perspective on this whole thing. So like a lot of events have already happened and Somni 451 is relating her version of events to an interviewer that is debriefing her both for posterity, but also to try and figure out how the system can be tuned up to be more airtight in terms of its exploitation of clones like her, because Somni is a clone who was developed to work at a place called Papa Song's that seems to me like it's basically McDonald's, like a fast food place where all of the employees look exactly the same and they just live to serve McDonald's food to the customers, and that's all they ever do, and they don't really have a culture outside of that. Their internal culture that they have is everything is kind of laid out in religious terms. So they have like catechisms and they have, like all of these ceremonies that an idea of that they're going to, if they do good work, then eventually they have a debt to pay, which is also that's a thing that's in a lot of religions, especially Christianity, that we have a debt to pay, and that when their debt is paid off after 12 years, then they will be sent to a beautiful tropical island of Hawaii, which was where Adam Ewing was headed, by the way, at the beginning of the book. And when they get there, they'll live out a life where they don't have to work and like a beautiful retirement tropical, which is kind of the promise of capitalism that gives to all of us, right? It's the one, work hard today and one day you'll be rewarded with a life of luxury. And that is the idea that Nietzsche was directly speaking against with the eternal recurrence. And you can see how there's a kind of recurrence of the soul in the book. So you can see how Mitchell is using the idea of eternal recurrence, not only to kind of shake you out of the complacency of sacrificing today to be rewarded for tomorrow, but also that these cycles, if we accept them, will repeat throughout time without evolving, right? These are not really changing. There's no real social progress happening here, right? The strong continue to exploit the weak all throughout time. And so Somni 451 is born into this life of servitude, and she doesn't know any other life. And she's being actively drugged by her employers to not be able to absorb new information or learn things beyond her job is. But then secretly, her regimen of drugs gets changed, and then she gets kind of like rescued / kidnapped out of the McDonald's place and brought to a university setting because she is part of an experiment to see if the clones can have the same level of cognition as quote unquote normal humans, to see if they are really subhuman, the subaltern are different in some kind of fundamental way to the civilized normal humans. And so there's that kind of racism entering back into the story, not like an explicit the color of your skin, but an idea, from Huxley's Brave New World, that there are different breeds of humans that are being genetically engineered, that some of them are smarter, some of them are harder workers, on and on. A caste system of humans. And this experiment is to see if the caste system really holds up. Can Somni 451, her intelligence, be elevated to the point of like a quote unquote normal person? And the answer is basically yes. Like, she becomes completely self-aware. She has a ravenous mind. She consumes all kinds of media, including a movie about the ghastly ordeal of Timothy Cavendish. And so a kind of adaptation of the events that we witnessed in the previous story. And so again, this nested story continues to have the chain of consequence of the reincarnation of this one soul keeps encountering its own narrative again and again. And when it does, encountering that narrative kind of pushes it into a new direction, a new kind of awareness. So during the time when she's watching this, about halfway through the story, or the point at which we got to when reading it, she has to pause the movie because they have to run away from officials who are trying to arrest her, or actually they want to kill her on sight because she's a fugitive. This brings us to the final story, So the heart of the nested stories, which is called Slush's Crossen and Everything After, which is written in a kind of dialect form. Which reminds me that there's lots of use of language in the previous part, the kind of dystopian part, where categories are being renamed for brands. And so like people don't wear shoes, they wear Nikes, stuff like that, right? And so we see like a shifting of language as we move into the future. And it's not clear to me how far into the future this is. I feel like it's more than 100 years even. But this story takes place in a post-apocalyptic genre. And so in that genre, typically technology exists in an almost like kind of magical state to the inhabitants of the story. And so they like revere things that are commonplace to you and me, like a plastic bucket or something like that, to be like, wow, this is like a magical material that is it super light, but doesn't break, it doesn't leak, blah, 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 blah. But to us, it's like a children's toy, a plastic bucket. It's no big deal. And so like our entire culture gets reinterpreted as like the lost golden age. And it disrupts the idea of eternal progress that happens due to greater and greater technology and greater abundance that capitalism promises to us. This instead shows a picture of like abundance has entirely collapsed into a state of depravity, of just being deprived of any kind of resources to the point where there are cannibals. And this whole time we've been talking about civilized people and uncivilized people. And this is like the very uncivilized behavior, right? And we associate a higher degree of technology with civilization. But as we saw in the Somni 451 story, they had some really advanced technology in terms of like all kinds of futuristic weapons and the ability to clone people in ways that they can control their behavior, and like very high-end chemistry in the drugs that they're using to engineer outcomes exactly the way that they want to. But all of that was not like more civilized. It was just in the service of exploiting other people, which feels very uncivilized. Part of the point of this book, obviously. And so the main character of this part, his name is Zachary, lives on one of the islands in the Hawaiian Islands, which was like I said, the destination for like the paradise of Somni's people, but also the destination of Adam Ewing in the beginning of the book. And there's a real like inversion here of that first story with Adam Ewing, where he was the European colonizer coming to the island nation with the greater degree of technology and encountering the natives and judging them based on the color of their skin, but also the level of their technology, and his, perceiving his own privilege as an affirmation of his superiority as a human and all of that stuff. In this part, it's all inverted. Like our perspective in Zachary is of a native person. He is indigenous to this area in terms of the post-apocalypse, and he understands thoroughly all of the intricacies and how complicated the local culture is. And they get visited by a more advanced technological people, from a lady from a boat, in the same way that Adam Ewing was from a boat. And she comes to study them and study their culture. But she clearly has like all kinds of things that seem magical to them because she comes from a more advanced society. You find out through her that they have perfected some kind of fusion technology. So they're able to generate electricity without using nuclear power or oil. So they've surpassed us in their technological capabilities, but at the same time, they don't understand the other people who inhabit the rest of the world. And it seems like that human culture, by and large, the global culture has utterly collapsed, and that humans are in a highly chaotic state where civilization has kind of failed. But anyway, the reason that I bring up the language in Somni 451's part is because in the Slush's Crossen, language has like taken a very left-handed evolutionary turn where the entire dialect is like completely different from the way that we talk now. You can figure out exactly what is being said, but it's all like a kind of pidgin dialect. It reminds me of something like Clockwork Orange and whatnot, where it's a very like particular way of speaking and everything is characterized within this like altered dialect, which makes it alien and removed from us. And this is characteristic of the post-apocalyptic genre, right? Like, not only has technology changed, the structure of society collapsed, but language itself has evolved and changed to meet the conditions of like a post-civilization society. So all of that plays into the post-apocalyptic genre that Zachary's story exists in and influences his voice. And he himself is telling the entire story as a spoken word story to a group of people long after the fact of the story happening, which has a framing effect such that we know that whatever happens in the story, Zachary is going to survive it. And it's going to be like a quote unquote happy ending. We don't know if he will accomplish his goals necessarily. So there's still some narrative drama in there, but we know for the most part that at least he is going to live through the events. And furthermore, within the frame of that story, there's an element of prophecy where he's told ahead of time at certain key events in his life that he should or should not do certain things, which I think feels to me like the last echo of the kind of Marushka doll nested story that has been driving through the entire novel. There's one last piece of here is an element of future story that is nested within this last story that is the furthest in the future. And even the frame of the story itself is set in the future of the post-apocalypse. But all of that to say, this story is basically a pretty standard kind of a quest narrative where Zachary leads this person who's visiting his island, who's part of a more technologically advanced group of people named Meronym. He leads her up the mountain to what used to be, from our civilization, an observatory. And while they're up there, he finds out that the god that they worship, named Somni, was actually like a real person and was in fact the person from the previous story that we were told about. And he watches the Orison recording of Somni, although it seems like he's not able to understand what is being said in the interview. But he is told the entire story from Meronym about her life, which means that it includes all of the other stories that we have seen up to this point. And Zachary's story is about, I would say, like shame, about questioning what is good behavior, what is a good society, what is being a good person, and what does it mean to be civilized or uncivilized. It takes all of the themes of everything that we've seen before and kind of ties them together in a very emotional way to me. And I think because the story is unbroken, it has really strong narrative effect. And this story feels the longest to me. I don't know if it actually is. Each of the stories feels progressively longer, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't actually know. Like if you just skipped from part 1 to part 2, which one would actually be the longest. But because it's an unbroken story, I feel very captured by it every time that I reread the book. And then when it lets off and we go into the back end of the book, that feels very downhill to me. Zachary has to confront elements within himself around his shame and cowardice that he considers to be like uncivilized and bad, and to make a choice of how he's going to treat Meronym. And the question is like, would he want to be treated that way, that he's going to like stab her in the back, literally, that he's going to betray her out of a sense of fear, a fear of her technology, of how powerful she is, to try and take her power away from her and use it for himself, or just general fear of like he just doesn't know what to do, and so destroying her would be at least a way to feel powerful and in charge. But he rejects all of that, and he protects Miriam, and he throws away his weapons, and they help each other, and they work together in the back half of the story to escape from the cannibals who try to, or who do successfully invade their part of the island and take it over. And so they have to leave their island, and Miriam helps him to go to a safer place and get set up there. And he survives and lives to tell his story to a group of people later. And he continues to pass on the story of Somni to the people of the future, like a true story, myth that says that she's basically God who of these other things. But even that story that is mythologized version of Somni tells us that in some way Somni did manage to affect the future, because we would assume from the way that her story ended, and again, I think this goes back to Number 9 Dream, that, where her story ended, it seemed like the rules had changed, and where she was kind of proving that everyone is equal, and that no matter if you're a clone or if you're a human who's born the natural way, everybody is still a person and everybody deserves dignity and equal rights and all of those kind of things. But all of that gets shut down when the police arrest her, and then later she's being interviewed. So obviously she's been captured by the authorities, and whatever change she could have affected is going to be stifled and destroyed. Clearly that's not true, because people know about her in far off Hawaii and worship her for some reason. And so that points to it's like a foreshadowing, I guess is what I'm saying, even though it happened in the past. This is kind of the weird way that Mitchell is playing with time in this book. And again, he plays with time in all of his books, and that's an idea that goes back to the heart of Bakhtein's theories of what the novel is. It is a form of art that is concerned with time and with place. And the passage of time is highly significant, but the ways that time can operate in a novel are unique versus other forms of storytelling, where the passage of time, at least for Bakhtin, like in, say, a fairy tale, for example, time is often fully arrested and doesn't matter. And so for like an example that he has in his theories, it'll be like a man and a woman are promised to be married to each other, and they see each other and they both fall in love with each other in first sight, and they're just deeply magically in love immediately. And then the woman gets kidnapped by pirates or something, and the man vows like he's going to rescue her. And then the rest of the story is like a series of adventures that could pretty much be interchanged with each other. Like it doesn't matter, like, what he does first or second or whatever. You could mix up the order of all the adventures, but the feelings that they have for each other don't change at all. It is as if emotionally that moment in time has frozen and nothing changes for those characters. They are as in love with each other all during the time of the woman's captivity and the man's heroics to rescue her as they were at the very beginning of the story. And so whenever they are finally reunited, it is as if time starts to move forward again, and then the marriage can happen and the story comes to an end. And so in this case, like, time has no effect on the story, actually. Nothing ever actually changes. That's not the point of the folktale or the legend. And that is one of the things that sets it apart from the novel, or how the novel sets itself apart from more ancient modes of storytelling. It actually does involve time, and time is change that happens over a certain period. And this book is all about how change happens and how that change can be driven forward through storytelling itself, and how storytelling kind of passes down the ability that humans can have to change the structure of our society, but also our own personal lives, I think. So it's a very powerful expression of Bakhtein's ideas around the novel and time and the effect that time has outside of genre. And yet, as I said, Mitchell involves genre in the whole thing as if to refute Bakhtein's position on what the novel can be or should be. And so after the story comes to a close, Zachary's story of the Sluisha Crossing, we go backward in time, but pick up from the point of where we left off with Somni 451 getting arrested. But actually, they don't get arrested at this point like we would have assumed, because she's like being interrogated. So you're like, oh, I guess this is when she gets arrested and then interrogated. No, they actually manage to escape. And you find out that the guy who she's been hanging out with, Heiju, is actually he's kind of like a spy or something, or he's like involved with the resistance against the government. And he takes her to the place where the clones that she's a part of are quote unquote retired. And she finds out that the drugs and the food that she's been fed for her whole life are actually made from the dead bodies of the clones that she was a part of. And that when people are retired, they're just killed in exactly the same way that we kill livestock nowadays to eat. They're just, euthanized and then put into like a butchery and just chopped up for food. And it's tragic and very sad, and it affects her massively. It radicalizes her instantly. She wants to take the government down and change how everything works and try to awaken all the other clones, because this idea is intolerable to her, that there is no reward for paying off your debt, that the entire system is rigged, and that every day for a clone like her is slavery until there's death, and then even in your death, you're exploited and recycled into food that feeds slavery and exploitation. And so she just can't stand that idea, and she wants to move against it. And it seems like her capture is actually staged, and the entire thing of her getting interviewed in the Orison is actually part of the revolution that she is orchestrating to free the other clones that are like her. And at the end of the story, she talks about how she either, I can't totally remember, she either did see or wants to see the end of the movie that was interrupted when the government agents tried to arrest her, which would be the rest of the story about Timothy Cavendish, which is the point at which her story ends completely and Timothy Cavendish's story begins. And just to say that, like, the whole thing with Zachary, kind of ended on in the way that genre stories do, with a kind of happy ending or like a good outcome, quote unquote. And I think Somni's story also ends in a good way, where the weaker or exploited group actually gains justice over the stronger group and inverts the power balance. And we know that going forward that Somni will be revered by future generations, which points to her probably having a victory in some way. And so what all of these things in the middle of the book seem like bad ending, bad ending, bad ending, bad ending, actually turn out to be good endings. And so moving on to Cavendish's story, or the end of his story, like after he comes out of having a stroke, he makes friends with a couple of other old folks who all kind of conspire together to do a kind of prison break or a heist style scenario where they get out of this place by calling one of the residents' relatives, pretending like there's a medical emergency. But of course, the person doesn't care about the medical emergency. They care about their inheritance. And anyway, they drive up there with a nice big car, and they're able to steal the car, and it's big enough to crash through the gates that are at the end of the road, locking them in. And they manage to drive all the way out to a pub where they celebrate and get some beers, and there's a soccer game on TV, and the nursing home workers catch up with them and are ready to do real physical harm to them, to literally beat them up. but the people in the pub, one of the guys in the group is Scottish, and he asks if there are no true Scotsmen in this Scottish pub because the English have come to beat up a man who's like their old grandpa or old. And they hear the South English accents of the people who have shown up to bring them essentially back to jail, and they all get the hell beat out of them instead. And Cavendish makes it out of there and manages to tell his story, and even, we know, gets a movie made about his exploits and has another bestseller on his hands, and reconsiders the rest of Louisa Ray's mystery that he might go ahead and publish it because it has a little bit of promise after all, and maybe he was being too hard on it, and he sees a lot of good stuff in it, actually. So again, another good outcome, and it follows the conventions of the picaresque kind of farce, funny novel where you have, the inversion of, we hated the character at the beginning, but by the end, we're kind of rooting for him and we're on his side, and the people who are even worse than him are getting punished. But he is still, at the end of the day, the kind of not nice guy bastard that we love to hate. So it follows all the genre rules. It has a good outcome, but it participates in this larger structure of a novel that is kind of defying all the conventions of time and space and how storytelling is supposed to work. But the second half of that Louisa Ray novel picks back up with her being underwater, and she gets out of there and manages to uncover all kinds of other clues and whatnot in her pursuit of shutting down this facility before things go too far and a terrible accident happens. The energy company ends up buying out the magazine that she works for, and they keep everybody hired on except for her. They fire her in order to try and bury the story. And she continues to follow the story and follow the report that Six Smith wrote so that she can publish it and break this case wide open. She follows it all the way to, like, the guy who tried to kill her has a yacht, and she tracks down where the yacht is, and she's pretty sure that he has the report, and all of these people are getting shot and killed, and Bill Smoke gets shot and killed, and it's just like, it's just like a very standard thriller. Like, things get crazier and crazier, more and more dangerous. There's less and less reason to keep pursuing this, except for the commitment that she has to truth and justice, and a belief that things could get better if only people knew the truth. And then finally, she does manage to get all of the report together, and she's able to expose everything and have an outcome of justice. And the little guy beats the big corporation. The scrappy journalist brings truth to the people, and the people accept the truth. So again, following those genre conventions, but again, inverting that whole, the weaker meat that the strong do eat. They don't eat her. They don't succeed. They don't succeed in dominating any of these weak people at the end of the day. It's all a matter of when you stop telling the story. In the pursuit of this whole thing, she was looking for a song at the same time, which turns out to be the song that Frobisher was composing, which he calls the Cloud Atlas Sextet, which gives the novel its name. Simultaneously, Cloud Atlas is an actual song's name by a Japanese composer who was married to Yoko Ono. They were partners before she divorced him and then married John Lennon, who wrote Number 9 Dream. So you have two books in these books by David Mitchell that are named after songs of men who married Yoko Ono, which is a little bit of a weird piece of trivia, but is true. I don't think that Robert Frobisher's Cloud Atlas is supposed to be that man's same thing. His song is a sextet, so in the same way that the book is a sextet. And so it's structured to be like several different musical voices, or, like flute and piano, what have you, doing the same melody and overlapping and building to something bigger and bigger. And she wants to track this music down. She hears a little bit of it, and it brings something back to her, because it's resonating with a past life, but it's also the song that Cavendish has a dream about, where it's like in some distant future, there's a girl serving McDonald's with this song in the background, which of course is a reference to Somni. And it's probably the kind of muzak that's playing in the background of her McDonald's job, her drudgery of her slave clone life. And so that this song itself is something that's handed down through the ages, a work of art that is speaking to people in different ways. And so the preservation of that song, because there weren't a whole lot of copies of it, is something that carries forward and keeps revisiting this one soul that's reincarnated again and again, in the same way that the storytelling also follows this one soul. So art exists with us through time and provides some kind of comfort or a solace, even if it is utterly kind of commercialized and devoured to be a tool of the supremacist. It still has this undermining effect of providing comfort and speaking directly to a deep part of the soul in a way that can't be anticipated by the supremacist forces. Maybe all that's a lot of reaching, but I don't know. That's how the song feels to me in the story. But in any event, Louisa Ray ends up, winning. The journalist beats out the giant corporation. And again, there's the whole thing about the song, which leads us back to Frobisher's story and the second half of the letters to Sixsmith, which Louisa Ray found the rest of those letters as she was trying to track down the report from Sixsmith, because he kept all of those letters. And so in the back half of Frobisher's story, we see that his affair with the wife Jocasta breaks down, and then he takes up an affair with the daughter where he feels like he's deeply in love with her. But he finds out after he finishes his song that she is engaged to someone else. And this leads him into despair. And then he wants to commit suicide. And he writes a final letter before committing suicide by shooting himself, which is an echo of how Sixsmith himself will die in a simulated suicide that's set up by Bill Smoke. And suicide is a theme that runs through a lot of the characters' stories. But I think it has a particular resonance between Frobisher and Sixsmith, because the letter is written to Sixsmith, but also they were deeply in love with each other. And so his story has a kind of tragic ending, or a bad ending, you could say, I guess, but he does manage to produce his art, which we do know lives on deep into the future and influences a person who in some ways completely overturns the entire order of supremacy and quote unquote progress and capitalism and all of that. And so at the end of the day, maybe his art made a very significant contribution in the fullness of time to the progress of justice, if justice can be said to have a progress. I think the kind of tragic ending, though, is in keeping with the romantic historical story, especially as it relates to Frobisher's queerness, his bisexuality. There are no happy endings for characters who exhibit homosexuality before the 20th century, for the most part. Like, I can't think of any. I mean, unless you're going way back, to like Achilles and stuff like that, Gilgamesh and Enkidu hanging out. But like, for the most part, if you're reading a historical novel set in Europe in the 1930s and someone's a homosexual, they end up dying in some kind of tragic way. And so the point being that it's in keeping with the genre in that sense, even in the kind of unfairness of that, or you could say like homophobia of that, Mitchell still preserves that element, the tragic element of it, because it's being superseded, I think, by the way in which he actually, Frobisher's soul itself can't be captured by the system. And it goes on to, in the end, unwind the system that is creating all this injustice anyway. And so, in a sense, Frobisher triumphs over them in the fullness of time, or at least that's how I see it. So it both follows the rules of the genre and follows the rules of the novel and shatters, the conventions of homophobia and things like that are built into the genre. Before Frobisher kills himself, he does mention in the final letter that he managed to track down the second half of Adam Ewing's journals, which were being used to prop up a bed that had one of its legs was too short, and so the bed was shaky. But he managed to pull out the second half of the journal and finish the story, which leads into the ending of the entire book, which ends back where it begins and has a kind of circular structure, which we also saw, of course, in Ghost Written and in some ways in Number 9 Dream as well. And so this kind of circularity to the entire novel's experience and a movement of, we moved forward in time and then we moved backward in time, but we see how all of time is connected, both forward and backward. There's a kind of retroactivity, right? Like I talked a lot in Frobisher's story about how in the fullness of time, his goals are accomplished, or like his justice for his death is achieved. But that's only because we already know retroactively what happens in the future. And so there's a weird relationship with time, I guess is what I'm saying, that at the end of the day, we know what's going to happen deep in the future. And that was already the case when we started Adam Ewing's story. And like I said, when we started the whole thing, he's thinking in these very colonialist, white supremacist, Euro supremacist terms that are highly ironic to us because we exist ahead of him in a more quote unquote progressive era. And because of our social progress, we kind of look down on him. But now within the kind of diegetic frame of the story, we can see that we know the future of what's going to happen to Adam Ewing's soul going forward. And so we understand the actual arc of his story in the fullness of all of the time that's even beyond our time in a post-apocalypse. And so we end the story with the same kind of foreknowledge that we began it, but a different foreknowledge that only exists within the tale itself. The story that we find out is that Ewing never had parasites, that he was being fooled by his doctor in order to be robbed, and that the native person, Atua, that Ewing helped to save, he ends up saving Ewing's life by helping him to, like, it's basically poison that Ewing is taking with these drugs. It's destroying his body. And eventually, when he dies, the doctor is just going to claim all of his property. And so he's just kind of extracting as much wealth as he can from Ewing until there's nothing left to take. And then he's going to kill Ewing and sell his body, for whatever he can make for it, pull out all of his teeth and use the teeth as a resource. So very much the same way that So Many 451 is, her body itself is recycled and the clones are just property. That's what the doctor is going to do to Adam Ewing. That's the plan. But Atua saves him and helps him to get rid of the poison. And then he gets off of these drugs that he's been given this whole time. And because Atua saves him, Ewing realizes that Atua is not actually less of a person than he is. He's just as much of a person as Ewing is himself. There's no supremacy, in other words. There can't be, because he's just as much of a feeling, thinking, knowing, capable creature as Ewing himself. And so Ewing resolves that he's going to become an abolitionist whenever he gets home and help to end slavery and achieve justice. And that, again, is a good outcome, and I think follows genre conventions as well of historical travelogues where, we as moderns want to read about these stories of people who, because of the adventures that they go through and all the weird things that they saw, their minds are changed to become more aligned with our modern sensibilities, and they see the world the way that we, in terms of we're all equal, we're all people who deserve rights, and equality is something worth fighting and dying for. So again, it follows the genre conventions of its particular story, but also aligns with the wider goals of the novel itself. And so just, wow, it just has like this crazy structure to it that is incredible, where you kind of get 6 books in one book, 6 very different books with very different protagonists on it, but somehow they're all one protagonist, and all of their stories are interconnected, even though it seems like they shouldn't be. And it's just like, it's really wild how he's able to achieve this. It's just such a unique novel. I respect it so much. Every time that I read it, I'm just blown away by the creativity and the genius that is involved in its structure and the way that he manages to pull it off with so much fun, but also at the same time, it's very moving, and I'm captured by all of the characters. So I just think it's a great book. The next one that I plan to read totally goes in a different way structurally from all of the other 3 previous books, and that's going to be Black Swan Green next time.